it could be. That's what it tells me. Now, whether that's because of Kawhi or whether it's because of his uncle, Dennis Robertson, I'm not so sure. From my understanding, remember, his uncle came out last month and emphatically declared that the ESPN reports by Woj and others was false, that there was no friction between Kawhi Leonard and the San Antonio Spurs. Well, if that's true, then that may be true with Kawhi, but that's not necessarily true with the uncle. Somebody has an issue with the Spurs. The Spurs has an issue with somebody. Kawhi could be, in the middle of all of this, obviously. Whether or not he's instigated it is unclear. But the relationship is not as ideal as it could have been. He's had issues, from my understanding, with the level of treatment that he has received from the San Antonio Spurs. To what degree, I do not know. But you have heard, and you do hear throughout NBA circles, that Kawhi Leonard is of the mindset that, from a medical perspective, he could be treated better. They've mishandled his injury, and so if he feels that way, you're the first-class organization that the San Antonio Spurs is. You are not going to take such assertions lightly. You think that you're first class from top to bottom. Obviously, Greg Popovich goes out of his way to protect the players. R.C. Buford is class personified. Peter Holt is one of the great owners in the sport. That's not something that you want to hear about your organization. More importantly, it's not really something you've ever heard. From the days of David Robinson to the days of Tim Duncan with Manu and Tony Parker and others, these are not the kind of things that you hear about the organization. This is not the kind of thing you hear about a coach that religiously goes about the business of protecting his players, so much so that there are times that he sat them down for nationally televised games, avoiding back-to-backs, making sure they happen at proper rest, all of this other stuff. This is an organization that prides itself on taking care of its players. Well, Kawhi Leonard or his uncle or the stories that are out there seem to be implying something totally different that has been disseminated about the Spurs as an organization for quite some time. Again, I do not know. I haven't spoken to anybody about this. Woj has been talking about it along with others. But these are the kind of things. You go from arena to arena. When the subject of Kawhi Leonard comes up, this is what you hear. And because that stuff is what's coming up and that stuff is what you're hearing, the relationship can't possibly be pristine at this particular moment in time, because the Spurs have ventured into uncharted waters. They are not accustomed to hearing these kind of stories about them as an organization on any level, and that cannot be a good thing, Max.
This is one of the most bizarre NBA stories I can remember really in my lifetime when you consider the participants involved. And I think that's why I and you and others, Stephen A., have zeroed in on the uncle. Because the relationship seemed to be in a good place and it's going along and he's getting better and better in the Spurs. And then the uncle takes over the business and now this. And so whether or not it's the uncle, just by logical deduction, that's the thing that seems to be different, right? In a relationship that seems, from the outside, to be excellent.
Before you go on, let me say this. I've been told directly that the uncle has been a problem. So I'm not deducing it to the uncle. I have been told directly that the uncle is a problem for the organization, even though he's categorically denied that.
I have heard the same thing, but I have not spoken to the Spurs organization, nor do I know his uncle. That's what people are saying.
Yes.
But I think that's why, even from the outside, you can deduce it. Like, everything's a certain way, add a catalyst, and then all of a sudden things change, and so you point to that thing that was added, and that's the uncle. Here is what's so bizarre about it, though, when you just, like, before we get into what's going on with the relationship, Kawhi Leonard, when last seen, I'm here to tell you, Stephen A., I know you say Kevin Durant, and Kevin Durant has more spectacular offense. Kawhi Leonard's one of the best players I've ever seen in my life, in any era. I think he's what Grant Hill would have been, ideally, if Hill never got hurt. I think he's a better version of Scottie Pippen. He is a guy who can carry your offense, take incredibly high percentage shots, work within it, not complain, do everything you want him to do offensively, and hit his shots at an extremely efficient rate, and then while guarding the other player's best offensive player all game as well as is humanly possible. I think Kawhi Leonard was the heir apparent to LeBron James. Nothing against Kevin Durant, who's an all-time great. But I think Kawhi, when healthy, was the second best player. And then you think that when last seen, they were up 20-something on Golden State in Game 1. And then he gets hurt and everything falls apart. And then you think that this might be Popovich's greatest coaching job yet this season. Everyone except for LaMarcus Aldridge is averaging 20-something minutes. They're third in the West. He's doing it with spitting bubblegum, smoke and mirrors somehow. And you would think Kawhi Leonard, given the level he was performing on when last seen, if he's ready to go, would be rushing to get back to San Antonio because they could maybe shock the world. We're all talking about Golden State and Houston. Add Kawhi Leonard, who knows? And yet he's not. So my first thought is he must be really hurt. He must be feeling that whatever's showing up medically, it doesn't feel right to him. But the more people you talk to, Stephen A., which is what I was getting at, you mentioned it earlier, the more it seems it's actually a relationship thing. And that, given the history of the San Antonio Spurs, Greg Popovich, and Kawhi Leonard, is shocking. It is possible that he's played his last game in San Antonio because when you hear Greg Popovich say what he said, hey, it's getting late in the season, he's speaking to Kawhi Leonard. He's not talking to us. He's saying, you got to come back if you want to play this year.
Go ahead, Mom.
This feels similar to what happened in Boston, and tell me if it is with Isaiah Thomas, because they mishandled the hip injury. We saw a few guys get fired from the medical staff. Do you feel like it's that type of situation?
Well, it remains to be seen. We really can't say that because you have to remember when Isaiah Thomas went down in Boston, he had, and you know, this was basically in the playoffs. Yeah. There's the off season, and then he had to come back, and they traded him. So it really wasn't about his injury. It was about the fact that they use it as an excuse because Danny Ainge didn't really want to give Isaiah Thomas $200 million. Obviously, you're thinking, Kyrie Irving is better, and that's where you want to spend your money on. In this particular instance, here's where things go awry if you're the San Antonio Spurs. The fact that we're talking about them, trust me, it's not something that's pleasurable to them right now. We also have to take into account this. Remember a couple of years ago, Max, when Kawhi Leonard agreed basically to a 5-year, $90 million deal. There were a lot of people that thought that Kawhi Leonard would be looking to give the Spurs a hometown discount. He had made it very clear he was not trying to hear that, not by a long shot. You've got him in position to sign a 5-year extension for $217 million in 2018. He's in position to do that, so he's not looking to jeopardize that. That could also be an argument. But here's the other reality. Greg Popovich, military guy. David Robinson was his guy, military guy. You got Tim Duncan from the Virgin Islands. My family, St. Thomas. He's from St. Croix. You know, it's a different mentality. Foreign players and what have you. Kawhi Leonard might be a little bit different, but it may speak to today's generation of players, what their mentality is, how it may be a touch different than what the Spurs have been customarily dealing with for the last 2 decades or so, led by David Robinson and then ultimately by Tim Duncan. All I'm saying is that I don't know. But as you look at these reports, as you talk to players around the league and other team officials, as you've heard the news percolating about Kawhi Leonard over the last couple of years now, how his relationship with the Spurs, certainly not, tense or anything like that, but it's not as loving, per se, as Duncan and Robinson and others were. Again, if there's any truth to that, then this happens. All of a sudden, you have to look at the Spurs just a touch differently because Kawhi Leonard's a relatively quiet guy, Max. And, he doesn't like himself in this situation, but he is.
Keep in mind, Kawhi Leonard's still in his mid-20s. If he's good to go and the relationship is beyond repair and they're looking to trade him, they should be able to get a haul for him. But he only has 1 more year on this deal before the player option. And that means that unless the Spurs want to send him to a place where maybe it's not in their best interest to send him, like the Lakers or some other team where they maybe don't want to see Kawhi Leonard there, if they send him to some other market where Kawhi Leonard wouldn't want to be and make him play that final year in a situation he doesn't like, they're not going to get the same return for him. The team's not going to mortgage their future for a guy who's going to be there for 1 year.
I know we got to go, but in fairness to the Spurs, let's say this. LaMarcus Aldridge wanted to get traded. Conversation with Pop, all of a sudden modifications were made. LaMarcus Aldridge seems happy. You never know that this is something that could be remedied. We're just talking about what's happening in front of our face right now.
No question. We'll have more on this for sure later in the show, but let's stay out west, gentlemen, as we head into the final